Welcome to our second video segment on Chapter 39, Corporate Formation and Financing. The previous video segment kind of gave us an overall review of sole proprietorships, partnerships, and LLCs. And again, when we look at the various types of business entities, we focus on four primary questions. The ease of formation and maintenance of that entity. Number two, the potential tax consequences involving that entity. Number three, the personal liability that might exist with regard to that entity. And number four, ability to raise capital or obtain financing for that entity. Now we move on to corporations. And we're going to, with those four questions and issues as a backdrop, let's take a look at corporations. It's a pretty long chapter, Chapter 39. So we're going to take it in various 10 to 12 minute segments until we get through the whole chapter. First off, a corporation is a creature of statute, a creature of law, both state and federal law. And as I've said before in prior classes, a corporation in the eyes of the law is viewed as a person. It is an artificial being created by law. And as an artificial being, let's go back to our constitutional law class that we covered, the U.S. Constitution. A corporation, since it's viewed as a person in the eyes of the law, has rights under the First Amendment, rights under the Fourth Amendment against unlawful search and seizure, and also due process rights. So again, it's an artificial being, but viewed as a person in the eyes of the law. Let's talk about corporate personnel. Who makes up the corporation? Well, at the very bottom of the food chain, in no particular order though, we've got the people who invested in the corporation, the people who purchased shares. They are the shareholders of the corporation. The shareholders of the corporation, with the exception of when the corporation is formed, after the corporation is running, each year the shareholders have the responsibility of electing the board of directors. The shareholders also have other power in other major areas involving the corporation, which we'll get into later. But shareholders can be individuals, or shareholders can even be other corporations and other businesses. It's very common for corporations to own shares of other corporations. So a shareholder can be either an individual, a person, or even a business entity. Above the shareholders, you've got the board of directors, again, that are elected by the shareholders every year. The board members are in charge of the big picture, the grand vision of the company and where the company is going. And so they take care of that, and they are the ones who also then, the directors appoint and hire the officers of the corporation, the president, the CEO, and the CFO, and various vice presidents, and maybe even a treasurer of the corporation. Those are the people, the officers are the people who run the day-to-day business of the corporation, and they report periodically to the directors. So shareholders, directors, and officers are the three groups that make up the corporation as far as who's in charge, who runs it, and their various types of duties. Let's see. So we've talked about we really haven't talked about any of those four issues yet, have we? So let's talk about liability. To what degree is there liability in a corporation? Well, the shareholders have limited liability, and that's one of the great things about a corporation. The liability of the shareholders is limited to the amount of their capital investment, what they have financially put into the corporation. So there's that issue addressed. What about taxation? When it comes to taxation, the corporations are different from sole proprietorships or partnerships. When a corporation makes money in the form of, we call it retained earnings, they can do one of three things with that money. They can put it in the bank. Well, first off, they got to pay taxes on it, right? It's money. It's taxable income. But the post-tax retained earnings, they can put in the bank and save it, or they can invest it in the corporation, buy more machines, buy more office furniture or whatever, buy more, any other number of things to help grow the business, hire more people, or they can take that money and pay it in the form of dividends to the shareholders. When they do that, the shareholders are then taxed for the amount of money that they receive as dividends. Hence the term double taxation. So the corporation is taxed when it makes the money, and then the shareholders are taxed whenever they receive a dividend. That's one of the downsides to a corporation, which is why, as I indicated in our previous chapter, the LLC, a lot of people like LLCs because it combines the best of both worlds. The LLC has limited liability, like in a corporation. The members are limited in their liability, like shareholders, but the taxation, if you've got more than one member in the LLC, the taxation can be like a partnership where the money passes through, the LLC is not taxed, but the members are taxed, and you don't have double taxation like in a corporation. Let's see. Since a corporation is a person in the eyes of the law, is an artificial being, it can be held responsible for criminal acts. And then you say to me, Bollinger, how can we put a corporation in jail if they break the law? Well, we don't put the corporation in jail, but we do impose a lot of fines and sanctions, financial sanctions upon the corporation. And make them feel the pain that way. And the people who are the directors and the officers of the corporation, if they engage in illegal activity on behalf of the corporation, they can be tried, they can be convicted, and they can go to jail for the bad acts that they perform on behalf of the corporation. Well, that's criminal liability. What about civil liability? What about tort liability in civil court? Well, let's talk about that. Let's go back to that weed whacker example. I injure myself in the garage when the weed whacker blows up after I bust it out of the box and start it up. Both myself and my nosy neighbor get hurt. I can file a products liability case against the corporation, the corporation that manufactured the weed whacker, or the company that distributed the weed whacker. I can file a lawsuit against the corporation. Corporation is considered a artificial entity. It's considered a person in the eyes of the law. It could be named in a civil lawsuit. So that's something you need to be made aware of. And they get sued. Corporations get named in lawsuits, and whether civil or criminal complaints, all the time. So let's move on. How do we classify corporations? Well, they fall into three basic categories: domestic corporations, foreign corporations, and alien corporations. A domestic corporation is a corporation that is formed in a state and does business in that state. If I file my articles of incorporation in the state of California and do business in California, I'm a domestic, my company is a domestic corporation doing business in California. Well, what if I decide to expand the business and start doing business in Arizona? Well, in that situation, I would be, if I start doing business in Arizona, Arizona would consider my corporation to be a foreign corporation, because my corporation, the articles are filed in California. And a lot of times, if I'm going to do business as a foreign corporation in another state, say Arizona, I have to file in Arizona a certificate of authority saying I'm a foreign corporation, but I'm filing this because I do have authority to do business here in this state as a foreign corporation. So you've got domestic corporations, foreign corporations. The third type of corporation is an alien corporation, and that is a corporation that's formed in a whole nother country. Let's say I have a business and I filed my articles of incorporation in the country of Mexico, and I want to do business in California or anywhere in the United States. The United States would consider my corporation to be an alien corporation. So don't confuse alien with foreign. Foreign is another state. Alien is another country. So there you go. different types of corporations can be classified that way. You can also classify corporations as a public corporation versus a private corporation. A public corporation is a corporation that's been formed for a public entity. Amtrak is a public corporation. I believe the U.S. Postal Service is a public corporation. Various cities, the city of San Diego, it's incorporated and is considered a public corporation. And that would be contrasted with a private corporation, which is a corporation that's a for-profit in making business to make money and is in business, like most corporations are. Let's see here. You have private corporations. Another way to classify corporations is a nonprofit corporation. A nonprofit corporation would be like churches. They're not in it to make a profit. They're nonprofit entities, and they are considered tax exempt, and in many ways they're exempt from different types of liabilities. That's a nonprofit corporation. Another type of corporation would be considered a statutory close corporation. That would be a corporation. Well, let's use a good example here. Let's say you graduate from Point Loma, and you and 2 other business majors decide to form a corporation. So you do what you need to form the corporation, and the 3 shareholders in the corporation are the 3 of you. Now, do you want to make it possible for these 3 shareholders to sell their shareholders to somebody else? No. These are the people you trust, and you want to be in business with them. So in a close corporation, you've got ownership of the shares by a close group of people, hence the term close corporation, and they agree not to sell their shares to anybody else. That is the close corporation is that's probably the most type of corporations that we have here in the United States. Closely held, family held type of businesses, which are run by a small group of people. The shares are not traded publicly on the stock market, but they're owned by a small group and held by that small group. And the shareholders, let's play that out. The 3 shareholders then will then also probably serve as the directors of the closely held corporation, and the 3 of them will choose, okay, who's going to be the president, who's going to be the vice president, and who's going to be the treasurer of the various officers of the corporation. So it's all one small group, all closely held. And usually if they put together that corporation, they're going to have their attorney draft for them what's known as a shareholder type of buyout agreement, so that if one of the 3 shareholders decides to leave, the other 2 shareholders can then sit down with him, assess the value of those shares, and buy that person out. And that usually happens when the person wants to leave, or if that 3rd shareholder passes away, then the 2 remaining shareholders approach the surviving spouse and buy out that deceased shareholder as well. So that's one way to keep the close corporation a close corporation. And one of the problems that you usually come across in a close corporation is that the shares, they don't treat the corporation the way they should. They act too informally. They don't adhere to corporate formality. That's very important, that they adhere to corporate formality, don't commingle assets, and adhere to that formality so that the shareholders, the 3 people don't get personal liability imposed upon them. One more thing, and I know I'm going long before we go to the last thing, and I've been so caught up in this I haven't done my slides. Shame on me. So, and these are available in Canvas. Talks about the various types of corporation, corporate personnel, talks about criminal acts and tort liability, and different classifications of corporations, which brings us to S corporations. What we'll do is we'll begin the next session with S corporations and pick it up from there with this slide, and that wraps it up for this particular segment. Sorry I went over time. Hope I didn't bore you too much.